Hello. So I'm here to talk about why manga matters. Manga matters because it's awesome. Thank you all for coming. Thank you. So the title is intended to be a little misleading because the truth of the matter is it's not hard to say why manga matters. It's fundamentally a question of why does entertainment matter. I probably wouldn't have to stand up here and title a presentation, you know, why do books matter? Why does film matter? But manga's a little bit different. Manga's a little bit different because, of course, it comes from Japan, but also because it's comics. And because I only have 15 minutes to explain why it's different and its impact on the entire world, I definitely want to compress this as much as I can. So I don't want to cover, I'm covering a lot of time. I'm trying to cover it in a limited amount of time. So I'm going to keep it simple, and I'm going to start with cave paintings 40,000 years ago. Before we had written language, we had a visual language. And that's pretty much, that's undisputed. Written language didn't come until about 3000 BC, or at least that's what Wikipedia tells me. But this kind of language of pictures to tell a story has been with us for literally tens of millennia. So this is not surprising then that manga, comics, is such a popular art form throughout the world. But its development throughout the world has taken very, very different paths. Now, when we look at sequential art, not simply using a static image to tell a picture or evoke a feeling, we end up with a lot of things we can look back to, right? 11th century, the Bayeux tapestry, embroidered by nuns, telling stories of war and history. In the 12th century, we have, now I put the name up there on the slide because I knew I wouldn't be able to remember how to pronounce it, the Choju Jimbutsu Giga. Basically, though, this was a series of scrolls that did tell a sequential story. Again, something where you went from image to image, and you would see that a story was taking place through that. In 1814, early 19th century, the preeminent Japanese artist Hokusai actually started to use the word manga. Now, what he made was not what we think of as manga today. What he made was a series of woodcuts, and manga was a Japanese term for whimsical pictures. To actually get to manga, though, and this is really interesting, at least for a historian, kind of a nut about this stuff like me, I probably should have turned the radio off before I started the presentation. Sorry. We actually have to jump over to Europe. Now, I can talk about this stuff for hours. What I did was, a couple of years ago, I thought I would present a panel at Anime Expo on the history of American manga publishing. My intention was to start, in the 1930s, 1940s. No, I'm sorry. I was going to talk about American manga publishing. I wanted to start in the 1970s with the first official book publishing of an English version of a Japanese manga. But what happened was, as I went down that rabbit hole, I discovered that the entire history of comics is incredibly connected. And so in order to be able to talk about manga, you have to talk about comics that were happening in Europe in the 19th century. And in 1837, Töpfer, who was Swiss, I'm pretty sure, was publishing works like this, the story of Mr. Woodenhead. He was taking sequential images and he was pairing them with text. And he was really the founder of the modern comic strip, which of course leads us directly into comics. This book, in fact, that he published in Europe in the 1830s, came to America in the 1840s, published in English, and it's really how comic strips started in the United States. Now, what does all of this have to do with manga? In the mid-1800s, there are a few things going on. As we all know, Tom Cruise successfully repelled the American invaders in Japan. No, that's not true. But The Last Samurai does tell a little bit of this story. Commodore Perry, actually working with the Japanese emperor, came to Japan and for the first time in 300 years opened the borders of Japan, allowing for a free flow of culture from the east to the west and back and forth. Now, meanwhile, comic strips are getting bigger and bigger in the United States and in Europe. In fact, they start to become a really important part of selling newspapers, as in the character, the Yellow Kid. And in around 1900, 1902, this is when we first start to see Japanese artists experimenting with the form. And what you can see here is they're actually working with something that's pretty similar to what you see everywhere else. The images are fairly static. They have some word balloons or text next to them. They're pretty standard, and it's going to be a few years before this changes really anywhere in the world. So in the development of manga, of course, I'm getting to Tezuka. 1930s is when Tezuka, inspired by Disney and Betty Boop, starts to create his characters all with really large, expressive eyes. And he starts to do things to try to get people to follow his style. He's successful. He's considered the god of manga in Japan. And everybody, you know, the reason why the characters all have big eyes today is because everybody is influenced from Tezuka's work from the 30s on up to the 80s. In the 1940s, around 1947, Tezuka starts to change his style, and he debuts a work called Treasure Island. But what he really starts to do is he starts to incorporate film-making techniques into making manga. And you can see that here, because this is no longer a static image. What Tezuka's doing is he's actually taking motion and creating it on the page. And when you, again, I'm going to just jump back for a second. When you think about it, when you look at what's happening in comics up to this point, this is a pretty amazing development. It's really, really huge that you're starting to be able to see a totally different way of telling a story. And I would argue in some ways, I mean, Tezuka was not the only person doing this. He's the one who gets the most credit, and I only have 8 minutes and 19 seconds to finish my story, so I'm not going to talk about the other people. But I would argue that this is the reason at the core why manga ends up becoming as influential as it is. But it's not the only reason. So it's the 1940s, right? Tezuka, he's doing this. People are starting to imitate him. Manga is starting to become what it is in Japan today. What it is today, just to give you some context, is an industry where 25% of all books published in Japan, and the Japanese read a lot more than we do, are manga. And as I like to joke, when you walk in Japan, if a printed piece of paper is flying around in the street, the wind picks it up and slaps it in your face, there's a 1 in 4 chance it's going to be a page from a manga. So manga is getting bigger and bigger in Japan over the course of several decades. And comics are getting bigger and bigger. I mean, over in the US in the 1930s, we've got Superman, we've got Batman, we've got Western comics, we've got all sorts of things happening. But the 1950s come along, and this is the time of McCarthy, this is the time of the Red Scare, this is the time when it's okay to go after anything that is different. One of those things is comics. And what happens is a psychologist named Frederick Wortham writes this book, Seduction of the Innocent. I've read it. I don't recommend it. It's really boring. But what he posits is that all juvenile delinquency, and I'm pretty much quoting here, all juvenile delinquency in the United States comes from comics. That comics are such a bad influence on kids that they should be banned. Nobody should be reading them. And this starts to take hold, you know? I mean, comics at this point in the US are starting to move out of just the traditional kids' superhero story. They're kind of moving into their adolescence. And some of the stories that are being told are very gruesome, no question, and that's why I put this image up here. And then what you have is newspapers writing that, you know, a kid, unfortunate teenager, hung himself. He committed suicide, but it's not okay to say he committed suicide. It just says that he read comics, and he read a lot of comics about hanging, and doesn't say anything else. Therefore, you know, I'm sorry, it does say anything else. Comics blamed for boy's death. Has nothing to do with anything else going on in his life, of course. And this is where comics in the US and manga in Japan, they part ways. What we start to see in Japan, now we certainly see plenty of manga for kids, no question. But we see lots of other things too. We see things that are really highly literate, as in this case, the manga Phoenix on the right, on the right-hand side here. One of Tezuka's greatest works, by the way, Tezuka in his lifetime did over 150,000 pages of manga. I've read as much as I can in English, but Phoenix to this day remains one of the most impressive to me. Meanwhile, American comics having to work with, and I kind of skipped over this, but what ended up happening here was there was never any actual government intervention in the American comics business. The American comics companies got together and created the Approved by the Comics Code Authority seal, and anything that didn't have it, stores wouldn't stock anymore. So they had very specific rules. You couldn't show somebody dying a gruesome death. You couldn't show nudity. You couldn't show stabbing. You couldn't show blood. I mean, it's a long list. And that's okay. I understand if you're making a comic for 6-year-olds. I have a 5-year-old myself. I don't want to give them a comic of somebody hanging from the ceiling. But that immediately assumes that comics are only for children. And this is where America has really parted. That's where America really parted ways from Japanese manga. As in the case here, there's this great website called Super Dickory, because a lot of superhero comics in the more in the 60s than any other time, would have to put these outlandish things on the covers to get attention. You know, Superman would suddenly have the head of an ant, and he'd be trying to figure out how can he go to work as Clark Kent if everybody sees that he has the head of an ant. And I mean, yeah, that's great. That's great for my 5-year-old, but it's, you know, it's really kid-oriented. You know, or this one where Superman is just mercilessly killing Lois Lane in space, and then of course at the end there's some twist explaining why he's doing it, and you know, and all is forgiven. But stepping back over to manga, and really to get to my point on why manga matters. Manga doesn't take that detour. Manga goes from being a medium for children, and really that's what it was in the early part of the 20th century across a lot of cultures, and it starts to grow. It starts to do different things. Tezuka does become most famous for Astro Boy, but he goes on to do things like Phoenix and Blackjack and Buddha, which is an 8-volume telling of the life of Buddha that's just spectacular. And in the 1960s, in fact, he decides that, you know how I could sell more manga? If I made cartoons and I put them on TV. And that is, in fact, what he does. He makes Astro Boy. It's not the first anime, but it's certainly the first really broadly seen anime. It shows in the US and Japan simultaneously, 1963. That's significant because, of course, as we look at the anime industry in the US, you know, this is where it all starts. This is where people start to grow up watching this. This is where people come acclimatized to this. And this makes it possible for things like Robotech to happen 20 years later, which makes it possible for things like Dragon Ball Z and Sailor Moon and Pokemon to come on TV 10 years, you know, whatever, later. And so on and so on. Meanwhile, in the US, we are also starting around this time, this is the late 70s, to get our first more literate works of manga. This is actually, of course, the biography of Barefoot Gen. And this comic book story, multi-volume, is actually nonfiction, and it's a reminiscence of surviving the bomb being dropped on Hiroshima. It's pretty hard in America at this time to imagine that happening when what we're looking at is more things like, you know, Superman trying to explain why he's murdering Lois Lane in space. Now, I'm oversimplifying, and anybody who's really familiar with comics will see that pretty quickly, because, of course, we start to see a number of things happening in the 1980s. We see Mouse come out, Mouse, of course, being a story of the Holocaust. We see things like Watchmen and Batman Dark Knight, and things that start to make American comics more adult, more sophisticated. But it's happening late. It's the 1980s. Meanwhile, over in Japan, they've had another 30 years to keep developing this form. So here's the point that I was trying to make at the very beginning. Why does manga matter? Because manga, as a comics form, has had decades to develop that didn't happen in the US. We're just catching up. Now you can find a lot of different comics. Now you can find stuff for adults and for kids. But in the US, comics represent less than 2% of total publishing in the United States. In Japan, like I said, 25%. But in the end, this is what leads us here. all of that leads us here. It leads us to a point where we can have a story about a boy who wants to be Hokage, and we can have a story about, you know, people trying to survive an unimaginable Holocaust and a truly horrific circumstances. We can have a story about a boy who bullies a deaf girl and comes to regret it and tries to spend his young life trying to make up for that. And we can have a story about Kuragahime, Princess Jellyfish, about a young woman who is so focused on jellyfish, that's like she's obsessed with them, and what's her life in Tokyo like with that? Why does manga matter? Because manga has had years additional time to develop in terms of what kind of stories can be told, and that's why it's so impactful on the entire world today. And thank you very much.